St. Paul Island lies in the central Bering Sea, more than 300 miles west of mainland Alaska. It is one of the two principal islands in the Pribilof group. The land is treeless. Low volcanic hills rise from tundra that remains frozen beneath the surface for much of the year. Wind moves across the island without obstruction. For most of the 19th century, the island was known primarily for its northern fur seal rookeries. Dense fog forms regularly during summer months. In winter, sea ice can surround the coastline. Storm systems move quickly across the open water, and landing is often uncertain even in moderate weather. There are no natural harbors. Supplies historically arrived by ship during limited seasonal windows. Once vessels departed, the island returned to isolation. Communication with the mainland depended entirely on maritime schedules. The settlement on the island was small and utilitarian. Structures were built for function rather than comfort. Wood was imported. Fuel was rationed. Every item present had crossed hundreds of miles of water. Silence defines much of the year. It is broken by wind, surf, and seabirds. Beyond the shoreline, there is only open sea. In this setting, distance is not measured in miles but in days of travel. Departure is deliberate. Return is never guaranteed. Permanent settlement on St. Paul Island began in the late 18th century under Russian control. The island's indigenous Anangan population, relocated from other Aleutian communities, was tasked with harvesting northern fur seals for the maritime fur trade. After the transfer of Alaska to the United States in 1867, federal authorities continued to oversee sealing operations. The community remained small, structured around seasonal labor and government administration. By the late 19th century, commercial interest in the Bering Sea expanded beyond fur. Marine resources were abundant. Entrepreneurs sought new industries that could justify the cost of transport and labor in such a remote region. Among these efforts was the establishment of a small processing operation sometimes described in contemporary reports as a lobster factory, though the species involved were more accurately large crabs native to the cold northern waters. The factory was not a large industrial plant by mainland standards. It consisted of a processing building, storage areas, basic sleeping quarters, and limited provisions. Equipment was shipped in by sea. Workers were transported seasonally. Operations depended entirely on timely supply deliveries and scheduled retrieval before winter conditions made navigation impossible. The labor force included both local residents and outside workers recruited for processing and handling. Most were accustomed to maritime conditions. They understood isolation as part of employment in the Bering Sea. However, the expectation was always that supply ships would return as arranged. Shipping schedules were vulnerable to weather, ice, and financial pressures. Companies operating in Alaska's remote waters often faced narrow profit margins. A delayed shipment could mean the loss of an entire season's output. When market conditions shifted or catches proved insufficient, decisions were sometimes made quickly and from a distance, with limited consultation of those on site. In the case that would later be remembered as the lobster factory tragedy, the processing season had been difficult. Catches were inconsistent. Weather interfered with regular loading and transport. The viability of continued operations became uncertain before the season concluded. The workers on the island were not explorers. They were wage laborers. Their presence was tied to contract and schedule. They relied on company management to coordinate transport and supplies. Few had independent means to leave the island outside of company vessels. As summer ended, provisions were calculated against expected departure dates. Flour, salted meat, preserved vegetables, and fuel were stored in quantities thought sufficient until the next ship arrived. The margin for error was narrow but not unprecedented in northern operations. There was no telegraph line connecting the island directly to the mainland at that time. Messages traveled only when ships did. Once a vessel left, those remaining could only wait for the next. The factory stood near the shoreline, exposed to wind and salt air. Its windows faced the Bering Sea. From inside, workers could observe approaching ships long before they docked. That visibility reinforced a sense of connection to the outside world. It also made absence unmistakable. When autumn approached and schedules began to shift, the settlement remained outwardly calm. Work continued. Equipment was cleaned. Accounts were prepared. The assumption was that departure would follow routine patterns established in previous seasons. No formal notice of abandonment was given to the laborers in advance. Decisions made elsewhere would determine whether a vessel returned before winter closed the sea. At this stage, uncertainty existed but had not yet hardened into crisis. The island had endured isolation before. Supplies were present. Structures stood intact. Routine gave shape to daily life. What had not yet occurred was the moment when routine failed. In the closing weeks of the season, transport vessels began departing the Pribilof region ahead of worsening weather. This was standard practice in the Bering Sea. Ice formation could begin earlier than expected, and once harbors closed, retrieval became impossible until spring. At the Lobster processing station on St. Paul Island, workers anticipated the final scheduled ship that would carry them back to mainland Alaska. Supplies had been measured against that expectation. Personal belongings were packed. Remaining processed product had already been loaded during earlier visits. Records from the period indicate that company management, facing financial losses and declining catch returns, altered its operational plans. The decision appears to have been made not to continue the factory through the winter. Whether through miscommunication, delay, or calculated withdrawal, a vessel did not arrive as the workers had anticipated. When the last ship visible on the horizon failed to alter course toward the island, the absence carried weight. Days passed without sail or steam appearing from the west. Fog limited visibility. Wind complicated observation. Still, no vessel approached. The workers could not confirm whether weather had prevented arrival or whether company officials had abandoned the operation entirely. There was no immediate method to verify. Without maritime transport, departure was impossible. The distance to mainland Alaska exceeded any practical rowing capacity in open water, especially as seasonal storms intensified. As autumn advanced, temperatures declined. Sea conditions grew unstable. Attempts to signal passing vessels were futile, shipping traffic had largely ceased for the season. It became clear gradually rather than suddenly. The transport that should have arrived before winter had not come. No additional supplies would be delivered. No retrieval was scheduled. Isolation was no longer temporary. It would extend through the winter. The workers were left with what remained inside the factory buildings and storage sheds. Their survival would depend on those reserves and on whatever the island itself could provide. The point of no return had passed without announcement. When it became evident that no ship would return before winter, the remaining workers at the factory on St. Paul Island turned to inventory. Flour was measured by weight and divided into projected daily allotments. Salted meat was counted and set aside under supervision. Barrels were opened and resealed to prevent spoilage. Kerosene stores were examined. Coal, where available, was calculated against estimated heating needs. The margin was limited but not immediately catastrophic. The factory buildings provided enclosed shelter. Sleeping quarters were consolidated to conserve heat. Unused rooms were closed off to reduce exposure to drafts. Windows were reinforced where possible. Snow fencing and salvaged lumber were used to block wind along the most exposed walls. Water required attention. In warmer months it had been collected from surface sources, but freezing conditions forced reliance on melting snow and ice. Fuel consumption increased as a result. The group recognized that fuel conservation would be critical. Leadership emerged through practicality rather than formal authority. Tasks were assigned according to strength and experience. Those familiar with fishing attempted to extend food stores by setting lines along accessible coastal areas when weather permitted. However, winter sees limited opportunity. Sea ice and violent surf made sustained harvesting difficult. Hunting on the island was limited. The Pribilofs are treeless and support little terrestrial game. Seabirds could be taken when available, but their presence declined as seasons shifted. Seal hunting was restricted by federal regulation and seasonal patterns. Moreover, the equipment at hand was not suited for large-scale marine harvest under winter conditions. The group established a daily routine. Morning fuel checks were followed by meal preparation under ration limits. Structural inspections became regular practice. Roofs were cleared of accumulating snow to prevent collapse. Exterior repairs were conducted quickly and only when wind allowed. Physical health initially remained stable. Caloric intake, though reduced, was sufficient in early winter to sustain basic activity. The greater concern was long-term nutrition. Preserved foods lacked fresh components. The absence of fruits and vegetables would become significant over time. Psychological discipline was maintained through routine. Evenings were structured. Equipment was cleaned. Written records were kept when paper permitted. Some accounts from later official reports suggest that workers maintained ledgers documenting remaining provisions and daily weather observations. Whether every entry survived is uncertain, but the effort to record indicates an attempt to preserve order. Storms intensified as winter deepened. Wind speeds common to the Bering Sea battered the coastline. Structures creaked under sustained pressure. Drifting snow obscured pathways between buildings. Movement outside required coordination and caution. Attempts to signal passing ships diminished as maritime traffic ceased almost entirely. The island entered seasonal isolation. Despite uncertainty regarding company intentions, the workers focused on immediate needs. Speculation offered no practical benefit. Survival required conservation, maintenance, and patience. By midwinter, the initial shock of abandonment had settled into procedure. Meals were smaller. Activity was measured. Heat was distributed only to occupied rooms. At this stage, their condition could be described as strained but organized. Supplies had not yet failed. Shelter held against the weather. No deaths had occurred. The assumption remained that rescue or retrieval would come with the first navigable break in sea ice during the following season. The winter, however, was not yet complete. As winter deepened over St. Paul Island, routine narrowed further. The sun remained low on the horizon, and daylight hours shortened to a muted band between prolonged darkness. Wind persisted without interruption for days at a time. Drifting snow altered the landscape until familiar paths disappeared beneath uneven white surfaces. Fuel became the central calculation. Coal and kerosene were rationed with greater precision. Fires were allowed to burn only during fixed intervals. At night, heat was reduced to preserve remaining stores. Workers layered clothing and shared enclosed sleeping quarters to conserve warmth. Food portions were reduced incrementally. Flour was stretched with diluted mixtures. Salted meat, once a staple, was reserved for intervals when physical labor demanded additional calories. The absence of fresh food began to register physically. Gums swelled in some men. Minor cuts. Healed slowly. Fatigue lengthened recovery time after exertion. These signs were early indications of nutritional deficiency, though the full implications were not yet understood by all present. Fishing attempts became sporadic. Sea ice formed unpredictably along the shoreline, breaking and reforming under tidal movement. Reaching open water required navigating unstable surfaces. The risk of falling through ice into freezing water was substantial. After several near incidents, such efforts were limited to calmer days. Seabird hunting provided occasional supplementation, but numbers declined as migration patterns shifted. Ammunition, where available, was conserved. Trapping yielded little. The island's ecology offered minimal winter sustenance. Maintenance remained constant. Roof beams were checked after storms. Snow accumulation was cleared to prevent structural stress. Doors were reinforced against wind-driven ice. The factory building, designed for seasonal use rather than overwintering habitation, required continuous attention. Health deteriorated gradually. Joint pain increased. Muscular weakness limited work capacity. What had been manageable physical labor in early winter now required extended rest. The decline was slow enough to avoid immediate alarm, yet consistent enough to erode resilience. Psychological strain intensified alongside physical symptoms. The absence of communication weighed heavily. There was no confirmation that anyone on the mainland was aware of their situation. Speculation about company decisions remained unresolved. Without external information, the future could not be measured. Time lost distinct markers. Days resembled one another in pattern and duration. Weather dictated movement. Storm intervals blurred into extended confinement indoors. Conversations reportedly diminished in length. Energy was preserved for essential tasks rather than discussion. By late winter, signs of scurvy, caused by prolonged vitamin deficiency, became more pronounced. Swollen limbs, bleeding gums, and increasing lethargy limited the ability of some workers to contribute to routine maintenance. The group adjusted duties accordingly, assigning lighter responsibilities where possible. At this stage, the strategy shifted from preservation of comfort to preservation of life. Fuel use was tightened again. Meals became minimal. Physical movement outside was restricted to absolute necessity. The expectation of spring became central. With it would come navigable water and, potentially, a vessel. Survival calculations narrowed to a question of endurance, whether remaining provisions and physical strength could outlast the winter's duration. The system they had built, rationing, maintenance, discipline, continued to function. But it did so with diminishing capacity. The season had not yet turned. By the final stretch of winter on St. Paul Island, nutritional deficiency was no longer gradual. It was visible. Swelling in the legs and joints limited mobility. Gums darkened and bled. Teeth loosened. Muscles weakened despite minimal exertion. What had begun as fatigue became incapacity for some of the men. Scurvy, a condition common in prolonged maritime isolation before the routine use of preserved vitamin sources, had taken hold. The preserved foods that sustained them through early winter contained salt and calories but little else. Fresh meat, which might have mitigated deficiency, had been scarce. The island provided no winter vegetation. Hunting attempts had diminished as strength declined. Routine adjustments followed necessity. Tasks once shared by all were reassigned to those still able to stand for extended periods. Snow clearing became irregular. Repairs were postponed unless failure threatened structural collapse. Fuel distribution was simplified. The system narrowed to essentials: minimal heat, minimal food, minimal movement. Illness did not advance uniformly. Some deteriorated more rapidly than others. Historical accounts of the incident indicate that deaths occurred before spring navigation resumed. Exact dates are uncertain, but official reports confirm that not all who were left at the factory survived the winter. Those who died were not buried deeply. The ground, frozen and hardened, resisted excavation. Snow covered shallow graves near the structures. The work required to prepare them consumed energy already in short supply. Silence increased within the factory buildings. Conversation required effort. Reading materials, if present, offered limited distraction. There was no sound beyond wind and the shifting of ice along the shore. The expectation of rescue remained abstract. No ship could approach until sea conditions permitted. The workers understood this constraint. Survival depended on lasting until the first navigable window. By early spring, the surviving men were physically diminished. Weight loss was visible. Movement was deliberate and slow. Yet the buildings remained standing. Fuel had not been entirely exhausted. Some provisions persisted in reduced quantity. The isolation that began with the departure of ships had matured into endurance measured by days without certainty. There had been no dramatic event marking their decline, only accumulation. Deficiency layered upon cold. Cold layered upon hunger. When the season finally shifted and ice began to retreat from the coastline, those still alive had endured months beyond expectation. The outcome now depended not on further discipline but on whether a vessel would appear. The sea would reopen. Whether it would bring assistance was unknown. In the early navigable season, when sea ice loosened its hold on the central Bering Sea, a vessel approached St. Paul Island. The exact timeline of notification remains partially unclear in surviving records, but reports confirm that a ship eventually reached the island and discovered the condition of the factory and its remaining workers. The buildings were intact. Smoke from a reduced fire may have signaled habitation. The survivors were physically weakened and required assistance to board. Those who had died during the winter were accounted for. Their deaths were attributed primarily to scurvy and prolonged nutritional deficiency compounded by cold exposure. No evidence suggests violent conflict or structural failure. The cause was cumulative deprivation. The surviving men were transported away from the island for medical care. Contemporary documentation indicates that several were in advanced stages of illness but survived after treatment. Recovery from scurvy, once proper diet is restored, can occur, though long-term weakness may persist. Official inquiries followed. Responsibility for the abandonment was examined within the framework of company operations and seasonal maritime risk. The remoteness of the Pribilof Islands and the unpredictability of the Bering Sea were acknowledged factors, yet the failure to ensure winter retrieval became central to the tragedy's record. The lobster processing operation did not resume under the same structure following the incident. Economic losses and public scrutiny contributed to its closure. There was no public spectacle surrounding the rescue. News traveled slowly from the region. The event entered maritime records as another example of logistical failure in remote commercial enterprise. The survivors departed the island quietly. The factory buildings remained for a time, exposed again to wind and salt air, their purpose ended. The sea that had isolated them now carried them away. St. Paul Island returned to its quiet routine after the departure of the survivors. Snow and wind reclaimed the shoreline. The factory, once active with labor, stood empty. Wood weathered. Rust formed on tools left behind. Drift accumulated along walls. Nature moved to erase the traces of human occupation. Historically, the incident became a reference point in Alaskan maritime and industrial records. It exemplified the challenges of operating in extreme isolation. Lessons regarding supply schedules, emergency planning, and human endurance were noted by later administrators and historians. The men who survived carried the memory of months spent in enforced confinement, of rationed meals and constant cold. Those who perished remained, quietly, part of the island's history. In the larger view, the episode illustrates the limits of human control in remote environments. Geography, weather, and isolation dictated outcomes more than intention. The lobster factory tragedy is neither heroic nor sensational, it is an account of endurance, loss, and the unyielding conditions of the Bering Sea. Today, the island is still marked by its remoteness. Few visitors arrive, and structures from that period are largely gone. Silence persists. The island remains a testament to survival measured not in drama, but in the quiet passage of days and the endurance required to meet them.